I'd like to welcome you all to the Sandwiching and History Tour of the Maumelle Ordnance Works, bunker number 4. I'm so glad that you all could be here today. I'd also like to thank the city of Maumelle, especially for allowing us to tour the facilities today, and also a very, very special thank you, since we just let them know about this, but to the park caretakers who just opened up the bunker for us so that you all could kind of peek in there and check out what it looks like. So hopefully you all know that you're currently in the heart of the city of Maumelle, but you may not know that the city was only officially incorporated as a city in 1985, so its history is just sort of beginning to grow. But the area as a whole underwent different kinds of development well before it became Maumelle. Most notably, as evidenced by the bunkers that you can see here, the surrounding area was used throughout the war effort, or was used throughout World War II to house facilities that produced ammunition for the war effort. But before we discuss that, I want to get a sense of how Maumelle developed as a whole before the war. So prior to large-scale settlement, there's some archaeological evidence that suggests that Maumelle was a part of the larger Osage territory, which they primarily occupied the northwestern third of the state. And so that was north of the Arkansas River. So in the few years after the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory in 1803, Cherokee clans from west of the Mississippi River, as they were moved west or pushed out of their homes, were moving into traditional Osage lands. So much of the Osage were forced to give up claim to their lands and move west into Oklahoma Territory after inhabiting the area for centuries. The earliest Europeans to explore the area, which were the Spanish and the French, as you may know, traded with the natives for decades. Those French traders were likely even responsible for the name Maumelle, which in French means breast, which is a physical description as you're going up the Arkansas River of Pinnacle Mountain. It's just the shape that it takes. So, fun fact, but also historical, so it's okay. All right, during the forced migration of the Indian tribes, the first American settlers began to move into the Maumelle area. In 1812, brothers Jacob and James Piatt led a group of people from Alabama and established a settlement on a site that would eventually become part of the Maumelle Country Club golf course. They intended to set up a lasting community, but they also could have been really early for their tea time. I had a different joke in there earlier to begin with, but it was a little more risque than that. All right, so still, they were fairly successful in their venture. By 1819, more than 150 people lived in Piattstown, which was the name given to the settlement. James Piatt's home was even the site of the first known Protestant church sermon given in Arkansas, and it was given by a Cumberland Presbyterian minister named John Carnahan. Besides also being home to territorial Governor James Miller, there was very sparse settlement in the Maumelle Crystal Hill area. Throughout the 19th century, there were only scattered small family farms. Maumelle continued to serve as farmland for small family holdings throughout the first half of the 20th century until in July of 1941, the War Department chose it as the site of one of its new defense plants to be built across the state. So these sites, and this was one of them, this area, if you can imagine, sort of like a 680-acre radius around this area, this was one of the sites. But these sites were part of a $700 million allotment set out by Congress in the fall of 1940 in order to bolster the military stockpile of munitions. Here in Maumelle, the facilities would officially be part of what was called the Maumelle Ordnance Works, which covered 680 acres of the surrounding area here. The other munitions projects in Arkansas included sites at Jacksonville, Pine Bluff, Camden, El Dorado, Hope, Fort Smith, Bauxite, Jones Mills, and Lake Catherine. They each were intended for specific purposes in the effort. Some facilities, such as the Maumelle Ordnance Works and the Ozark Ordnance Plant in El Dorado, refined materials that went into explosives and other weaponry. Others, such as the Arkansas Ordnance Plant in Jacksonville, the Pine Bluff Arsenal, and later the Naval Ordnance Plant in Camden, produced actual ammunition and weapons. Plants in Bauxite, El Dorado, and Jones Mills produced other wartime resources like aviation fuel and aluminum for airplanes. The Southwest Proving Ground in Hope was used to test weapons before shipping. All these facilities together cost around $241 million to construct and operated throughout the duration of the war. As much as possible, the buildings at each site were built of wood to reduce costs, and they were only meant to operate for a period of 5 years, which is fortunate because that's how long the war lasted. The majority of them were owned and funded by the United States government, but often they were operated by private companies. However, an arm of the government called the Chemical Warfare Service operated the Pine Bluff Arsenal because it housed chemical weapons materials. The Quartermaster Corps and Army Corps of Engineers primarily oversaw the progress of the construction of each plant. These projects also helped bolster local economies and even change the face of labor in Arkansas. Every site employed hundreds or thousands of Arkansans during the war, either in construction or as permanent workers. Of around $40 million that was allotted for the construction of the Jacksonville plant and this plant, around $16 million of it was spent on labor at those locations alone. Many of the building materials were purchased from local suppliers, and the majority of the plant workers came from the Little Rock area. Since it primarily used assembly lines in its production, the Jacksonville plant employed up to 14,000 people during its peak production, about 75% of whom were women. And personal fact, my wife's grandmother, Fana Smith, was one of those, and she actually lost part of her finger working on the munitions at that plant, but she was always really proud of that. So, so by 1944, 3,085 African American workers contributed to the plant's labor force, including 55 supervisors. The Pine Bluff Arsenal saw similar trends, employing up to 9,000 workers, many of whom were women and African American. In a way, the family farmers that had spent the previous century on this land in and around Maumelle were ushered out along with the small agriculture-based economy of Arkansas once these munitions works began. Ultimately, these large undertakings helped industrialize many Arkansas societies. In order to create this plant, this one that we are on right now, or used to be a plant anyway, the government purchased around 7,000 acres west of the Marche area through eminent domain and began surveying the land as old inhabitants moved out, or sort of were forced to move out. As an Arkansas Democrat article stated in September of 1941, as initial construction began, few families lived on the construction site, and all of them have moved. One large timber operator is clearing his marketable trees out of the area, and with 3 sawmills in operation, should quit the area within a short time. And they did. I think everybody, all private citizens and companies were out by October of 1941. The Federal War Department was granted approval to enter into contract with the City Service Defense Corporation on July 15, 1941, in order to construct the Maumelle Ordnance Works. The Lummis Company of Little Rock was subcontracted to build the facilities. The next month and a half were spent surveying the land, clearing trees, laying all necessary water and gas lines. 2 large warehouses were also constructed to house building materials as they were delivered. The primary construction work began in early September and was due to be complete within 10 months. However, not just the facilities needed to be built, but also roads and rail lines, in order to transport raw and finished materials. So they began work on that as well. 6 to 8 miles of railroad track were laid, and an extensive road system was built which connected to Highway 65. During the early stages of construction, this is a fun fact too, during the early stages of construction, around a dozen horses were kept on the site to be used by the construction quartermaster, foreman, and other officials due to extremely wet conditions. So it was just all mud, pretty much, and they had to travel, the foreman had to travel around on horses. Major Harry S. Bronson, the construction quartermaster, is often seen in the Arkansas Democrat articles from the time atop his horse as he oversaw the project. Construction continued on pace throughout the end of 1941, at which point the plant was only about 20% complete, according to Major Bronson. The plant was being constructed to produce ammonium picrate using picric acid. Picric acid was primarily used as a bursting agent in missiles and other ammunition since the First World War. Ultimately, the entire compound was to consist of 9 ammonium picrate production units, cooling towers, an ammonium oxidation plant, acid concentration facilities, an administration building, a cafeteria, a hospital, a fire station, a carpenter and smith building, an auto shop, storage for vehicles, a warehouse, and 21 of these bunkers. So if you can imagine a bunker like this around the site, there were 21 of them at one point. So by February of 1942, the plant began ordering materials to produce the ammonium picrate. In March of 1942, as construction on the many facilities continued, it was decided that the plant should increase its production capacity by 50%, adding 3 more picrate plants. This led to a longer timetable for completing the project and a halted schedule due to delays in the arrival of the materials needed to construct the extra units. Finally, all 9 units were completed by the end of May 1942. The War Department requested that production of the picric acid and ammonium picrate should begin by July 16, 1942. All the facilities on the rest of the compound were not complete until August of 1942, but by that time the explosive materials were already being produced. By the time production was ceased in August of 1945, Maumelle Ordnance Works had produced 113,692,135 pounds of ammonium picrate. Decontamination also began during that month and was completed by the end of the year. The compound and a small contingent of plant workers were kept on standby for months after the facilities were cleared. They were used for various purposes, the buildings anyway, the bunkers especially, were used for various purposes during this period of inactivity, such as storing explosives that were being moved across the state, so explosives that were in transit. By early 1947, parts of the larger safety zone areas surrounding the 680-acre compound were returned to the former owners or sold, because they had actually purchased 7,000 acres, which essentially covers all of Maumelle. So much of that land, or some of that land, was returned to former owners. The government continued to control the thousands of acres of land until it was declared unnecessary for further use in 1959. The General Services Administration listed the property for bidding and found an acceptable offer in 1961 made by the Perry Equipment Company. The Perry Company salvaged the remaining equipment and materials from the site facilities. When they finished, there were still thousands of acres not being used, so the company sold the land to the city of North Little Rock, but it continued to remain unused by the city throughout the remainder of the decade. In the late 1960s, a prominent businessman in the area, Jess Odom, many of you who are from Maumelle, I'm sure that you are familiar with the Odom name, he created the Maumelle Land Development Company, and armed with a development plan for a modern community and $45 million in assistance from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, he began building what was called Maumelle Newtown. Newtown was kind of like a common name being used across the country at the time for new industrial communities popping up all over the nation. By 1974, the first residents began to move in, but property sales did not keep up with investment costs. The Newtown project was somewhat abandoned as the Maumelle Land Development Company sold much of its land holdings to private developers. On June 20th, 1985, after North Little Rock attempted to annex the area, Maumelle was incorporated as a first-class city. Lake Willistine itself was developed a year before the incorporation of the city and covers about 100 acres of the original 680-acre plant site. So what happened to all the facilities that were part of the Maumelle Ordnance Works? After the government decommissioned the site and the Perry Company salvaged as much as possible, throughout the 1960s and 70s, efforts to raise the remaining buildings took place. The bunkers proved to be the most difficult to get rid of, obviously, as the city left 3 remaining here around Lake Willistine. They are each less than a mile apart and have different uses. To the east, over here, there's bunker number 3. You can kind of see the edge of it. That was owned by the city, or I believe it still is, but it was used for various purposes for a while, including fire department training and things like that. To the west, further down there, you can kind of see the lip of it, is what was once an enclosed bunker, just like these two, but it was converted into a pavilion for the park later on. And here, just behind me, we have bunker number 4, which was placed on the National Register of Historic Places on May 24th, 2006, in order to preserve what remains of the Maumelle Ordnance Works. As has already been noted, these bunkers were primarily used for industrial purposes rather than defensive purposes. Explosive materials were stored in them, so as you, if you go in there and kind of peek your head in, just imagine them sort of full with chemicals that would go into explosives. So these explosive materials were stored in the bunkers throughout the course of the Maumelle Ordnance Works operations from 1942 to 1945. and they were built as defensive bunkers with steel reinforced concrete and buried in the earth for additional concussive protection. Ultimately, these bunkers connect Maumelle to a time when it was being developed before officially being developed. It was a time when the war effort on the home front brought more industry into the state and transformed local labor patterns. This was also the period when Maumelle transitioned from a small farming area into a land with industrial potential, eventually becoming a thriving city with many thousands of residents, many of whom are here, I suppose. So this concludes the Sandwiching and History tour of the Maumelle Ordnance Works Bunker number 4. Again, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and feel free to enjoy the park today as you visit the bunkers. This is, you know, all 3 of them are less than a mile apart, so it'd be I suppose you could endure the sun for a little bit and walk to each one of them. Our next Sandwiching and History tour will be on Friday, July 6th at 12 p.m. at the William Woodruff House, which is located at 1017 East 8th Street in Little Rock, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you. Appreciate it.